How's everyone doing? Oh, stop being quiet. How's everyone doing? Oh, I don't like quiet. I'm in a house that is very loud all the time. So the differential between quiet places, like if I go in a library, it freaks me out. It's too quiet. So you can be loud. Everyone say hello to everyone at home. Hello, everyone at home, Liberty Online. Thank you for joining us. So we're into part 2 of the series called Drift. And so if you are watching online and you haven't watched the first one, you can actually pause me now, go and watch the first one and come back. For you in the room, if you missed it, tough. So basically, we ended up talking about that we end up in places that we don't plan, want, or expect because we just allowed our life to drift unchallenged somewhere in a direction, effectively, that the environment dictated. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit for the next minute, just to recap what I talked about last week and then dive in a bit deeper. We read from Hebrews 2, verse 1 that says this, sort of summarizes what we're talking about. It says this: we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. The Bible's really clear. You need to pay attention. We need to be purposeful. We have to be proactive so we don't drift away from the things that we've been taught in the past and what we're trying to build our life on and where God's calling us to go. And I mentioned about this term, and I said I love alliteration, the constant currents of culture. We're going to talk about that more next week. You don't want to miss it. You don't want to miss it. But we are all, I said, misc it with a biscuit. And so we're all at risk at drift. That's what I said last week, that all of us, it doesn't matter who you are, you're all at risk at drift in a direction in life that God doesn't want you to do or go. And I asked, why is that? And the point was that drifting effectively is passive. You don't have to do anything to drift. All you got to do is relax, lift your feet, and the tide or the currents or the rip will take you in a direction. And it's the same with the constant currents of culture. If you just are passive about it, you'll drift in a direction that even you don't want to go in. And I said you don't have to do anything really bad to end up somewhere really bad. You don't have to do anything really bad to you don't have to do anything really bad to end up somewhere really bad. You just lift your feet and go with the current. And so I said last week, perhaps you've drifted in an area of life, whatever that might be, in your physical health, in your finances, in your relationships, in your relationship with God, whatever it is. And I asked us to hone in on some of the things that perhaps we've drifted in and ask, why does it matter if we do? And what I said last week was that we rarely drift to somewhere better. We rarely drift somewhere better. When we're not active, when we're just going with the flow, we rarely drift somewhere better. And I said that we eventually, if we just leave that unchallenged in whatever area of life, that we eventually suffer loss. And so I finished last week saying, in whatever area it is in your life, do you need to stop drifting? Is there an area of life where you need to stop drifting? And I think if we're honest with ourselves and we examine ourselves and reflect, we can probably think of at least one area where we're drifting in a direction we don't want to go. And so, for the next 2 weeks, I want to explore some thoughts about how to not drift. Because it's all well and good me saying about we shouldn't, let's not drift. And the Bible says be careful not to drift. But I want to resource us or get us thinking at least about how we can not drift. How to not drift. And some of you are thinking, well, in the sea, that's easy. You just have a boat with an engine in. And talking about that, have I mentioned I used to work at Centre Parks? Have I mentioned that before? Used to work in Centre Parks years and years ago. At 16, I had a lifeguard job. And anyone knows me well, actually, you don't even have to know me well. You just have to glance at me, knows that any time there's any form of heat or I move or it's a day with a Y in, I sweat. And so I sweat a lot. So me in the subtropical swimming paradise, not a good combination. Just sweating constantly over the guests. They come and ask me, excuse me, lifeguard. I flick my long hair, which I had back in the day. And all the sweat whips them in the face. It's not a good combination. And so as soon as I could, I moved to the water sports lake outside. Lovely in summer, but in winter, not so nice. And so I worked on the water sports lake, putting people in pedlos, and pushing them out, getting them back out. And then I got upgraded. I got taught how to play the powerboat. It was playing. I wasn't an instructor or anything. I was in charge of people's safety, but I was playing. That's my point. I was playing in the safety boat all the time. Now, I was in charge of the powerboat. You'd go out, drag people around, rescue anyone who's drowning, all that sort of stuff. And so what you'd have to do sometimes, some days, the windsurfers would go out the sailing boat. We had a big sailing boat as well. And anytime there was any wind, because it wasn't the best place for wind for sailing, but when there was, it would come in, it would be strong, and people would flock and come and have a go at windsurfing. And what's great to watch is someone on a windy day who's never windsurfed before. Honestly, you could just sit there with a picnic watching it. It's hilarious. And so, but what happens is, over time, is that everyone who doesn't know what they're doing drifts down to the end of the lake where the wind's blowing in that direction, because they don't know what they're doing. They're just being blown along. They're drifting, all right? And so what you used to have to do in the powerboat is to go all the way to the other end of the lake and tow them back. So what you do on it with a windsurf, you get them to fold the sail down the front. They'd sit on the board. You'd hold onto the back of onto the sail, and then you'd power along, not too quick, because then they fall off. Didn't do that on purpose any times. And so power them back and drag them to the other end of the lake, right at the other end of the lake, and set them off and say, see you in 10 minutes. And you just do this over and over again with hundreds of people on a windy day when the wind would take them and it would catch them. Even pedlos on a windy day when the wind's right against you really sometimes struggle, because people go out, set out. Who's gone out on a pedalo before and they've underestimated the energy it takes to you to actually go, and you get halfway out to sea and then you go, oh, I can't do it anymore. And so often we drag them people back. But the point is that they had to tether, so they'd tie on or join to the powerboat, and I would drag them back to safety. And that was essentially my job when it was windy. But you think it sounds quite easy, but it's actually really tricky. As a powerboat player, it was really tricky to actually drag people. And the heavier the thing you were dragging, the more drag it had. I know that sounds really simple. But the heavier the thing that you were having to drag, the more drag, if we talk about physics, the more drag it created in the water. And it was really hard to actually direct. And if, when I was first there, what I'd do is I'd be lazy with a pedalo. They used to have chains on the front. I'd clip it on the back of my powerboat so I didn't have to hold it, because otherwise it would hurt your hand. And so I'd clip it on the corner of the back of the powerboat where there used to be two little hooks on either corner. But because it wasn't in the center and the pedalos were mentally heavy, you'd go and it would just pull you to the one side, and you couldn't drag it in a straight line. And so it was really difficult to actually drag something really heavy in a direction that you wanted to go. And so you'd end up going sideways. And you've all experienced this, even if you're not a powerboat driver. When you're in a trolley, who's ever had a really heavy trolley and there's a bit of a hill going in one direction and you've got a child as well hanging on the side, pulling in one direction? You can't control where it's going, and that's what it's like driving a powerboat with someone being towed behind. And so what's my point is that they need to be anchored to something bigger or more powerful. And so the sailboat, the windsurf, the pedalo, whatever, to get back, to not drift, they had to be tethered to, anchored to something that was bigger so it didn't drift, or heavier, or had more power, the powerboat, to drive them in a direction against the current or against the drift or against the wind. And I remember this one time that we had a big boat, a big sailboat. You could fit like 6 people on it, which for the size of the lake was too big. And so on a really windy day, your proper sailors would come out. And sometimes, I remember this one time, the wind was so strong, it blew them right down the end. And they couldn't get back at all. They couldn't tack against the wind. And so I ended up trying to pull them back. And I couldn't do it. The wind was too strong. It was just battering us all around. And I was towing it. The boom arm was swinging around like this, smacking them in the heads, And in the end, I was just like, I can't do it. It's too dangerous. So what I had to do, we were like halfway back, and I ended up just cutting them loose. And they were like, ah! But don't worry. I whizzed around the back of them, got them out of the back of the boat, and took them to safety in the powerboat. And on this windy day, the sailboat was dragging me. I'm the rescuer, and I'm supposed to be dragging it to safety. But because it was so big, because it was tethered, because it was connected to me, it was dragging me instead of me dragging it. And it was really quite dangerous. And you see, I was tethered to something that, despite my best efforts, and I was trying hard, caused more drag than my power could fight against. I was connected to something that caused more drag on me than I could power against. And you might think, what's the point? And I'll come to it in a minute. But my point, I guess, is that no matter how much power we have sometimes, if we're tethered to something that has more mass or is just stronger than us in an area, it will cause us to have drag and drift in a direction we do not want to go. And so I was constantly being dragged. And I thought someone's going to get hurt. And the only option, like I said, was to cut it loose. I had no other option. Someone would have got hurt. I had to cut it loose. And I powered off, and ended up having myself to anchor to something that was bigger or more powerful than me in the powerboat. And that was the jetty, the floating jetty. Now, if that was to flow down the lake, we're in bigger trouble. And so it got me thinking about this simple truth when I was thinking about this story, is that our drift is determined by our drag. All right, our drift is determined by our drag. If you're drifting in an area of life, whatever that area might be, it really is irrelevant, but it's determined by your drag, what things are causing drag in your life. And you know the physics behind it. You know, when you're driving in your car when you're a kid, you used to put your hand out the window, put it like this, you can get like an airplane, but you put your hand out, oh, and you get dragged. The drift is determined by the amount of drag, by our drag. And a big part of how much drag we have or how much we create is what we are tethered to, what we are connected to. And so our drift is determined by our drag, and therefore, vis-a-vis ergo, what we are tethered to determines how much we drift. And that's a really long-winded way of me telling you a story to get you thinking about what you're connected to causes you to drift in that direction. What we are tethered to, what we're joined to, what we connect our life to determines how much we drift. And so if you're drifting in a direction you're not happy about in any area of life, I want you to reflect and think, what am I tethered to? What am I connected to which is creating that drift, that is creating that direction of pull? In my powerboat, I was connected to the sailboat. It was causing drag and drift that I didn't want. I had to cut it loose. I had to disconnect. There's a great example in the Bible, a great story. I haven't got time to read it, and it's a story in itself, but it goes on to talk about another thing. But it's so rich. As when the Apostle Paul, he was a prisoner, basically doing his thing for Jesus, and people didn't like it. And so he was a prisoner, but he asked to be put before Caesar. He's like, there's lots of motivations behind that perhaps, and we can go into that another day. But he declared, I want to be put before Caesar. I don't want to be let go. I don't want to be prosecuted. Put me before the man in charge. And so he declared, I want to be put before Caesar. And that was a dangerous thing to do. But what they decided was they're going to set him off on a trip, on a boat, under guard, as a prisoner with other people to be sent on trial, if you like, before Caesar. And very dangerous. Just the journey is dangerous alone. Let alone, traveling at sea back then was very dangerous. But the prospect of putting your life in somebody's hands on trial, very dangerous. But they set off on a course of action. Paul set off on a course of action that would change the face of the planet. It really did. Him doing this thing changed the face of the planet, where Jesus is now a global superstar. It wasn't because of Paul, but Paul was obedient. And so he was on this journey as a prisoner in a boat. And we'll read Acts 27 from verse 1. And we're going to jump through this for time. It says, Acts 27 verse 1. I'm reading from the NLT. It says, when the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. And for time's sake, because they set out and have a bit of trouble, but we'll jump to verse 9. It says this: we had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. And he said, men, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. If we set out, there's trouble ahead. It's not like he was not wanting to get where he's going. He wasn't trying to stop being a prisoner or not getting to Caesar. That's what he wanted. But he said there's trouble ahead if we go on. And sometimes we can see that in our own life. There's trouble ahead if we go on. There's trouble ahead if we allow ourselves to drift in a direction. He said shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. All them things. Verse 11 says, but the officer in charge of the prisoner listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul, which you can understand. And it says this: and since Fair Havens was an exposed harbour, that's where they were, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbour with only a southwest-northwest exposure. So it says in verse 13, when a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it, so they pulled up their anchor. They pulled up their anchor. The thing that they were tethered to, the thing that was causing drag, that was stopping them floating off, they pulled up their anchor voluntarily and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and the wind of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. You can imagine Paul then, can't you? Told ya. That's what I'd be like. It says in verse 15, the sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run. Because often if you turn a sailboat directly into the wind and let the sail loose, you'll just flap in the wind and you won't go anywhere. You'll drift slowly backwards, but it's quite safe. But they couldn't even do that. The winds were so strong and powerful. So the sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard, check this, they hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. So all this time, like many people who are out at sea, they would have had a lifeboat, a smaller boat, a smaller vessel out the back that was being towed by the bigger boat. Just in case something happens to this boat, we get in the little boat. And what was happening is that because, just like my example at Centre Park, because that boat was being battered and pulled and dragged in directions, it was causing drag and difficulty for the sailors to the point they're like, we've got to get this in on the boat because it's causing problems. They lifted the anchor that was keeping them safe, and then they threw out a sailboat at the back that made drag worse. And then they're like, oh, that's really stupid. And so they pulled it up and brought it into their own vessel. Verse 17, then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They're definitely scared. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars of Syrtis of the African coast. So they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship. See, they understood. They're sailors. They get it. They lowered the anchor to slow the ship. They understood drag. They understood if we're tethered to something and we're going to put it in the water to create drag, an anchor on the bottom of the sea to drag along, hopefully get hooked in something perhaps. So they lowered the anchor, the sea anchor, to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. And so that thing saved them probably because it made it slower. They lowered an anchor to purposely cause drag on the sea floor. So they've got two instances here of being tethered to something. Two instances where they're tethered to something that was causing drag that was desired. And that was the anchor. They wanted that drag. They were tethered to something that caused drag that kept them safe. But in another example in the same story, they were tethered to something which the lifeboat, what a name, the lifeboat, you connect yourself to something that's got the word life in it, you think it's good, tethered to something that was actually causing drag and causing drift and causing danger and loss of life. So tethered to two different things, and one causes drag which is good, and one was drag that was bad. Acts 27, jump to verse 21, please. It says this, a little bit later. No one had eaten for a long time, and finally Paul called the crew together and said, men, you should have listened to me. Thank you very much, Paul. Men, you should have listened to me. My wife has this line all the time. It's true, I should have listened to you. Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all of this damage and loss. He says this, but take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. Oh, thanks, Paul. None of you are going to die. We're going to lose the ship. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. God's like, I ain't done with you yet. Like, you ain't drowning at sea. Doesn't matter what happens. You're being saved because I've got a purpose for you. You've got to go before Caesar. This has all got to happen because this is part of my wider plan. What's more, it says this, God in his goodness, he told this to the guys, what's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So God could have gone, you know what, I'm going to let everything smash up, like Titanic style, and he's going to be like Rose on the bit of wood, you know, like pushing other people off. Leonardo DiCaprio, get off, you're too heavy for the wood. Never understood that wood was always big enough for two. She just didn't like him, that's what it was. But that could have happened. God could have just saved Paul, but God in his goodness saved everybody because Paul's on board. He could have just, and what happens later? The ship gets smashed up. Like he said, the ship's going to sink anyway, but they all have to swim to sea, which we're going to read, swim to land on a bit of wood. So he could have got sharks to come and got everybody else, apart from Paul, but he didn't. He granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island, and that's a great story in itself. So, I had said a little while ago, what we are tethered to determines how much we drift. What we're connected to, what we're tied to, what we're tethered to determines how much we drift. And in this story, two things saved the sailor's life in this instance. Two things. Something in the natural, if you like, the anchors. They grip the bottom of the sea. They create a drag so the ship didn't drift to a place they didn't want to go. But really, when you look at this more deeply, the reason the sailors were saved was because they were tethered to Paul. These sailors were saved because they were tethered to Paul. They were connected to Paul. That's the only reason God told Paul, I'm going to save them because they're around you. I'm going to save them. They're not going to drift or suffer loss or die because they're connected to you. They're tethered to you. They might have bought some time being tethered to a natural anchor, but they're tethered to you, Paul. And you're on a mission from God. And he said, because they're with you, you're going to be safe. I'm going to stop you drifting because you're tethered to this godly man, if you like. But really, they were tethered to Paul. But there's nothing particularly special about Paul, other than the fact that he was anchored in Jesus. And so it's not that they were connected to Paul per se, it was that they were connected to Paul who was connected to Jesus. And so they were indirectly anchored to Jesus through tethering to Paul. And my point being is that we need tethering, we need anchoring, but to the right things. And so I ask you, what are you anchored to? What are you tethered to? What are you anchored to? Because whatever you're tethered to, and we've got hundreds, probably thousands of connections in our life, relationally, things at work, habits, hobbies, all them things that we're tethered to, that we're connected to. What are you anchored to stop you drifting? That's really my question. Not what are you anchored to. What are you anchored to that's going to stop you drifting? Because there's some things you are tethered to or connected to that cause you to drift, like the lifeboat, like the sailboat at Center Parks. What are you connected to? What are you anchored to that will stop you drifting? Are you anchored to good habits that are beneficial to life? Are you anchored to friends who love you? Are you anchored to church? Are you even anchored to Jesus? That's probably my biggest question. You know, if you're not anchored to Jesus and you've never done that, made that decision, that's something I would encourage you to do. But who are you anchored to? What are you anchored to? What relationships are you anchored to that stop you drifting? Because I know a few times in my life, I only survived a few things because of the people I was connected to. And I don't say that flippantly, I mean that. I've only survived, and I mean with my actual life, because of the things and people I've been connected to. So it matters hugely what and who we are connected to. And if you want to not drift, if there's an area in life where you are drifting, take a look at what you're tethered to. Take a look to what you're connected to, what your hooks are in, or maybe what hooks are in you. And at the heart of it, you know, Jesus is the anchor for our soul. But that can look a different way to lots of different people and have many facets with connections with other Christians and people who follow Jesus too. But I want to say he's the anchor for our soul. He really is. So tie your life onto him. and somebody else who leads a church might tell you how you should do that. Here's your tick list of how you tie your life onto Jesus. And I don't really do that because I think God interacts with us differently. Your Heavenly Father interacts with you in a special way that's just for you. Just like my relationship with all 4 of my kids is all wildly different. So I say, tie your life to Jesus in whichever way you can. Maybe you don't know any knots. Maybe you're like me working on a water sports lake and know no knots. My knots would just make the bundle as big and tight as possible. It's going to hold. And if that's all you've got to tie onto Jesus, then that's fine. Do that until you learn some knots. But Acts, let's jump through. I'm raveling now. Acts 27, jump down to verse 30, says this. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. Paul just said, don't worry, everything's fine. But we're going to sink. What would you do? You'd do what these sailors done. They tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat. There we are again, that thing that they're connected to in their life that brings them security, that would actually kill them. It says they lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors. So what they were doing is putting out anchors. And it was like Titanic. They were trying to get in the water and get themselves safe and paddle away and let everyone else die. That's what they were trying to do. That's what I read into it anyway. As though they were going to put out anchors from the ship or from the front of the ship. But they weren't. They were putting the lifeboats down. And verse 31 says this, but Paul said to them, to the commanding officer and the soldiers, you will all die unless the sailors stay aboard. Don't let them leave. We're all going to die. We will all die, not just us on board, but all the sailors too. Everyone's going to suffer loss if they don't stay on board. So it says this, so the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Imagine what a choice to make. What a choice to make. Someone saying, we're gonna sink. This boat's going down, and you make the decision, right, let's cut the lifeboats out. It seems counterintuitive, but Paul said this is what needs to happen. They cut it off, they let it go. You see, these lifeboats that were supposed to save lives, Paul said if you actually allow yourself to drift off in them, you're going to die. So cut the ropes. And so what I want to ask you for those areas in your life that maybe you're tethered to something that's causing drift, I want to ask you, what ropes do you need to cut? What connections do you need to cut? What ropes do you need to cut? What tethering things, what you joined onto that you've got no business being joined onto, that you need to cut? Because they're causing you to drift because of the drag that they create on your life. And we could go through there's thousands of things in our own life, and maybe there's only one or two that are applicable to you, but you know, I spoke last week about unhealthy habits, you know, with me with food, putting on weight over the last few months, having been so busy here. For you, it could be tethered to food, so it's got such a grip on you, connected to that you can't break that tether, that anchor that you've got in food, and so you drift into putting on weight or just into being unhealthy. You don't have to be fat to be unhealthy. It could be that you're tethered to drink or alcohol, and you need to cut that link because it doesn't do anything good, and you drift in a direction. Not there's anything wrong with it inherently, but if it's dragging you, it's causing drag in your life. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's drugs, pornography, gaming, addiction, whatever, if it's sin in the way that God might describe it, that's you're tethered to, that's causing drag. But it could be anything. It could be a person. Maybe you're drifting in a direction, in an area of your life, and you know it's because you're tethered to a person who causes drag in that area. And you're not strong enough. Just like me at Center Parks, the sailboat had more mass, had more inertia, had more wind behind it than I could cope with. And maybe you're tethered to a person who just drags you along, and you're powerless to them because of your personality type or your history or whatever. And sometimes you need to cut the rope. And I don't say that flippantly, like you just do that willy-nilly. Maybe it's an activity that you're tethered to that draws you in a direction. Maybe it's a job that drags you in a certain direction because of the drag it takes on your life. And that's not an easy decision to leave a workplace where you're providing for a family or yourself for your future. Maybe it's been tethered to an attitude that you've had for years. And you need to cut the rope to it. A belief about yourself, a belief about a limitation about you, your own insecurity. Maybe it's being judgmental, whatever. It can be unforgiveness. You've tethered yourself. You've connected yourself to not forgiving someone from something in the past, and it causes drag and drift in your life constantly. And you can't get out of that drift until you cut the cord to it. The same could be said of shame or guilt. It's endless. Maybe you've got a great relationship, but you're drifting in a direction that's unhealthy because you're tethered to jealousy. And it just holds on to you constantly, and it just drags you in a direction you have no control over, and you need to cut the cord and make some decisions. It could be anger, it could be blame, it could be memories in the past. It could even be excuses. Maybe you make excuses about why your life's going in a direction. And the only thing causing that is you being lame and attaching yourself to an excuse for why you don't have to overcome it. You see what I'm saying? It's endless. It's so individual. It's about you, about your life. And maybe you've been drifting in a direction and you know it's not good. You know it's not where God's called you to be in whatever area. And disconnecting is sometimes the only way you can reduce the drag and stop you drifting in that direction. Not just like at Centre Parks, cutting the cord to that sailboat, cutting it loose. So what do you need to cut loose? Let's finish this story off. Jump down to verse 39. It says this: when morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline. So they'd gone some way. But they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get ashore by running the ship aground. It says this: so they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed towards shore. But just like Paul said, but they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship struck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves, and it began to break apart. So the boat was falling apart. It happened just like Paul said. But in verse 44, it says this: the others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore. They escaped safely to shore because they removed the tethers that were causing drag in their life that were going to kill them, the lifeboats. And they stayed connected to their anchor, but also to Paul, who was anchored in Jesus. So the two questions to contemplate from this story for you, for me, is: are you tethered to things that cause drag? And I mean drag in a bad way, that end in you suffering loss. And are you anchored to something bigger that stops you drifting? And so the two things there, if you've been drifting in an area of life, I really want you to think about this practically. What do you need to cut off? And what do you need to now anchor to stop that drift? What do you need to cut off and allow to drift off away from you? And what do you need to now anchor into? And that'll be different for every one of us. So how do we stop drifting? Cut those things loose and anchor to something bigger and more powerful than yourself. And my main encouragement would be Jesus, but it's not just that as well. It can be hundreds of other things around that. It could be anchored into church, anchored into healthy relationships, anchored into being accountable for it could be hundreds of different things that are good, healthy anchors to be anchored into that will stop you drifting. So I encourage you to cut the ropes to anything that draws you away from God, that drifts you away from God, that causes drift in a direction you don't want to go. And encourage you to tie yourself to Jesus, like I said, in the tightest knot you can, however you can do it, so that when the storms come, and they will, that you will, just like these guys, you might be battered and beaten and broken, but you're still exactly where God called you to be. That you're anchored in something that's not moving. You might get smashed apart and come out all bruised, but you're anchored, you're exactly in the position God wants you to be. So you can escape safely to shore. And so, the way I see it is that Jesus is the ultimate lifeboat. He is. He's got the big enough engine to drag any sailboat to safety, and he can anchor into the ground and not move at all. But he's the anchor for our soul. So let's tie ourselves to him. And let's cut everything else loose that makes us drift. So my bottom line, if you hadn't got it already, is anchor yourself in Jesus so you do not drift. Anchor yourself in Jesus so you do not drift, whatever that looks like to you. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for this